Hi everyone, I'm Miran. I am a Syrian journalist with a background in chemistry, but having grown up with seeing the wars in Syria and Iraq, I've come to understand them and how they connect with each other. And first of all, there's basically the obvious thing. You have the same propaganda driving both wars. Democracy, regime change, dictatorships, we have to liberate the people, and the superior West has to pass down its superior democracy onto these barbaric nations. Nobody seems to question, however, that the West itself doesn't have a proper democracy, especially when you have a Clinton and a Bush, and a Clinton and a Bush running to power, and the same people are constantly running things behind the scenes. Another war narrative that is often pushed forward for both this war in Syria and the war in Iraq are the WMDs, the chemical weapons. In 2003, you had, well actually in 1991, they forced Iraq to disarm its chemical weapons. And the reason they did that was not out of humanitarian concerns or because these weapons can kill civilians, but because these are terror denial weapons. They are basically an answer to nuclear weapons. They are a cheap man's nuclear weapon. And that's why they call them weapons of mass destruction, because they can kill thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of people. And the US cannot risk invading a nation or attacking a nation when that nation has nuclear weapons or chemical weapons. And so disarmament is pushed before any sort of imperialism, like overt imperialism takes place. So in 1991, when Iraq disarmed, the US then later, in 2003, comes back with the narrative that they didn't in fact disarm, and that there are some hidden chemical weapons still left over. And they use that as a casus belli for attack, even without a United Nations resolution or any word from the OPCW that agrees with them. And as a matter of fact, this kind of sequence was so predictable that in 2014, in an interview I did with Vice, when they asked me what I predicted would happen now that Syria has given up its chemical weapons, I said that I predict the US is going to claim that Syria has not completely disposed of its chemical weapons and use that as an excuse to airstrike army positions, possibly after another small chemical weapons attack is set up. This is going to be a similar scenario to the lead-up of the Iraq War in 2002. I believe the US will start airstriking the Syrian military as well as al-Qaeda-linked rebels, effectively attacking both sides of the war. Now, I'm not a psychic, this is just how they work. And I think it should be obvious to everybody by now. And the other war narratives that have been pushed forward are what Jay touched on, minority governments. And at the same time, they have a contradictory, simultaneous narrative that they have to protect minorities. So they have to get rid of minority governments, but then they have to protect minorities. And it's a bit schizophrenic. And one of the things you hear, like Saddam is a Sunni, majority of Iraq is Shiite, Assad is Alawite, majority of Syria is Sunni, and the fact that these governments are secular in their basis doesn't feature. And the fact that Obama was black and black people are a minority in the United States didn't occur to him when he said that Syria had a minority government. So, so now, once they kind of destabilize the country or even get rid of its government, then they move on to the second narrative, which is that they have to protect the minorities. So in Iraq's case, Saddam gassed the Kurds, or more recently, ISIS is killing Christians and Yazidis, so we have to go in to protect them. And in Syria, at the moment, they're protecting the Kurds. But even in 2014, we had some hints that they were pushing forward the new narrative, which is that they have to protect the Christians and even the Alawites. And it became a perplexing thing, because all along they were pushing for al-Qaeda to take power in Syria, and for them to turn around and pretend that they're protecting Christians and other minorities is ridiculous. And I guess perhaps that was a bit of a premature narrative push, because the plan was always for Syria to be divided and for Assad to actually run away to the coast where the majority of Alawites are. And in doing so, basically disband the army and create a situation where the US can come in to save the Alawites. And the only way to create a situation where you have to save the Alawites is to create the threat that's attacking them, which is to create terrorism. So I'd like to go to backwards now, but maybe 5,000 years ago, thereabouts, I don't know, 1,750 BC, and just to see how Iraq and Syria connected. Back then, in the olden days, Syria and Iraq were separate entities, but then under the Assyrian Empire, they were connected as one state. It's a very famous empire. It brought a lot of things to our society. And then under the Roman Empire, they were again considered Syria and Assyria, separate states, but they always had some sort of connection between them. And the reason why this is significant is these people from 5,000 years ago, like the people, their history and ethnicity, they still exist today. And the considerations that existed way back then, they still exist today. I mean, the Armenians still exist, the Syrians certainly still exist, and all of the battles that were happening 5,000 years ago are actually affecting what's happening now. And here comes Sykes-Picot. When the Ottoman Empire fell, of course, sorry I misspelled Sykes-Picot, excuse me, but when the Ottoman Empire fell, basically the French and the British divided the Middle East amongst each other. And the narrative is kind of pushed forward subtly in the media that Iraq and Syria are artificial nations because the borders were drawn up by Sykes-Picot. Well, in reality, the borders that were drawn up by Sykes-Picot were wrong only because they didn't encompass enough territory of the natural borders of Iraq and Syria. So the purpose that Sykes-Picot had in drawing up these borders is to try to, as much as possible, create landlocked nations. Lebanon and Kuwait were basically created as a way to restrict Syria and Iraq access to the Mediterranean and Gulf Seas. They were also designed to divide population centers from resource-rich areas. Kuwait holds a lot of petrol, and Lebanon holds a lot of water. So this is a way to kind of make sure that people stay in poverty. And of course, finally, they want to divide people along sectarian lines and keep them fighting with each other for centuries or decades to come. And Lebanon and Syria were exactly created under these religious sectarian lines. Initially, in fact, Sykes-Picot wanted to create even more divisions inside Syria. But all sects of Syrian society, all religions were against it. So if you look at the first map, that is in fact how the Sykes-Picot was meant to be drawn up. There was supposed to be an Alawite state over here, a Druze state. Damascus and Aleppo was supposed to be divided. But the only thing that they achieved was the region of Lebanon, because of the Maronite population there. They achieved that division, and they annexed this Turkish part, right here. And if you can just keep this in mind and compare it to the new Sykes-Picot, the new drawing up of the Middle East and the divisions that they want to create, you can see that it's very similar to the states that, well, they divided Lebanon, they divided Hatay. They want to go back and get their Alawite state, and they want their Druze state as well. And with Iraq, they want to divide Sunnis and Shias and Kurds. And the only thing really different about this map to the previous map, which I'm not going to risk going backwards, is that they have this Kurdish section here. So this Kurdish section wouldn't have existed back then in Sykes-Picot's time because the Kurdish population in Syria wasn't nearly as significant. The only reason it grew in Syria is because of the Armenian and Assyrian genocide and the Kurdish population's involvement and help of the Turkish government in doing that. And then subsequently, the wars that were fought against Turkey, multiple wars that were fought by the Kurdish uprising against Turkey, to try to get their own independent state. And as a result of that, there were several influxes of refugees coming to Syrian territory, which continued up until the 50s. So this is something I'm going to talk about more deeply in my next talk. But the interesting thing is, this map here, the beginning map, is from the center, so the Council of Foreign Relations. Much of these maps are drawn up by think tanks that the Washington government basically replicates every advice that they're given by these think tanks. And as you can see, they wanted to create not only like the Kurdistan and Alawite states, but something called a Sunnistan. And if you compare that to the borders of where ISIS is, you can see that ISIS is exactly the Sunnistan that they wanted to create. In fact, ISIS has been essential to all of these plans because the Syrian war and the sectarianism that happened in the Syrian war would not have been possible without the Iraq war. It wouldn't have been possible without the introduction of violence and weapons and militias and hatred between Shiites and Sunnis in Iran and Iraq, if not with the Iraq war. And the US at the time of the Iraq war, I remember the theme of the media was saying was that we need to prevent a civil war, and the US is like there to prevent a civil war. But as a matter of fact, they were acting to always undermine the unity of Iraq by introducing, for example, federalism into the constitution, for removing a secular government and introducing a religiously leaning Shiite Dawa party, by disenfranchising one sect and empowering another, and getting an army built from one sect to fight, cities that were resisting in another. And also, they would even go down to, well, I'll just say, Saudi influence also funding these groups. And finally, they would even stoop to creating false flag attacks. These two men are SAS soldiers. They were caught by the Iraqi police, the pro-US government Iraqi police, caught them dressed up as Arabs, shooting at them. And this was a story that was quite hidden in the media because on that very same day, British tanks destroyed the entire police station to get these two men out. So you can see that they were already trying to get some sectarian tensions happening. So I'm gonna rush. I hope I have time. So Syria and Iraq, now the foreign policy papers are coming out with: do Syria and Iraq exist? Do they, should we even consider they exist? And should we base our U.S. policy on the idea that these sovereign nations that are seen as sovereign under the United Nations exist? Basically, they're saying that they no longer exist. And of course, the narrative is that Sykes-Picot got it wrong, and that's why there are wars. And by separating these nations under sects, this will be the end of wars. But in reality, the wars are happening because the imperialists want to implement Sykes-Picot as it was originally meant to be implemented, dividing people further. And you might ask, why would that be? Well, of course, it's easier to control landlocked countries. It's to make sure they're resource poor, to make sure they continuously fight alongside each other, and they want to have a way to get their oil pipelines through without having to ask a government that controls the land to get their pipelines through. Now, at the moment, the US is actually building illegal military bases in the north of Syria, and they've also got plans to invade from the south so they can connect their pipeline through. And speaking of these think tanks that are redrawing these maps and creating these maps of the Middle East, I believe Condoleezza Rice called it the birth pangs of a new Middle East. What she meant was, all the children that were dying in Iraq, that suffering was just the birth pangs of the new Middle East. All of that, it actually is predated by the Israeli Oded-Yinon plan, which was written in 1982, which said explicitly that these nations should be divided under sectarian and ethnocentric lines so that they would be in perpetual war with each other, and Israel could have a casus belli of expansion. And in fact, at the end of the day, a lot of it is about imperialism, yes, but there is this other agenda driven under the scenes of a greater Israel, of a creation of expansion of Israel, driving populations out, you know, the land that is written in the Zionist handbook is that everything from the Nile to the Euphrates. And of course, the Kurdish borders that are being drawn up by these think tanks are everything beyond the Euphrates. And that's why you have Turkey coming into Syria with Operation Euphrates Shield. Because these borders and this chaos that's been happening has been planned a long time ago. So the thing is, though, that these, redrawing maps, you might not be someone who's a nationalist, you might not care about borders, but in order to redraw these maps, ethnic cleansing has to take place. Because in order to create areas that are designated for different sectors of society, you have to get rid of the areas of the ethnicities that are already in certain areas. So, for example, to create the Kurdish state right now, in Iraq and Syria, the Assyrian minority is getting pushed out of their land by the Kurdish, the US-supported Kurds, Yazidis. And ISIS has been crucial to this because whilst the Kurdish militias are well armed, the other ethnicities have no arms and no training. And in fact, when they do arm themselves, the Kurdish militias threaten them with attack if they do not disarm. And once they disarm, there has been recently, in fact, in Iraq, where the Peshmerga basically left the Assyrians and the Yazidis to the devices of ISIS. So ISIS has been basically the enzyme that's built to create these states. And there's going to be more on that in my next presentation. But I'd like to finish off with a little bit of a counter statement, because these things are not set in stone. For example, really what they expected was for the Al-Qaeda to be too strong, to overwhelm the Syrian military, and to begin to do what they promised, which is to ethnically cleanse Christians and Alawites. And what they hoped was for Assad to run to the coast, and then therefore they would come in with a savior complex and create an Alawite state. That hasn't succeeded, because in fact, the people of Aleppo who were running away from the Al-Qaeda rebels, the majority of them are Sunni, and where did they run? They ran to the coast. So this is actually the opposite of the ethnic division that they want to create. In fact, they achieve more of a unity inside the coast. The only thing that they have been moderately successful with is the creation of this Kurdish state. And now Kurds are 1.5 million people in Syria out of a population of 22 million. So you can imagine, 1 out of 22 trying to take over these swaths of land which are filled with oil and water. So the counter narrative of that, however, is that Syria is planning to connect Palmyra, Deir ez-Zor, and Qamishli, and thereby cutting off what would have been a sliced in half Syria. And that's probably the reason why the US is conducting airstrikes on Deir ez-Zor, the Syrian army location, because even though it's been under siege by ISIS for so many years, they really want it to fall. So this is what's happening now. I will talk more about the ethnic cleansing element of it, and more specifically about which areas are being ethnically cleansed in my next talks. I hope you will stay.